It began with a silence, then a shock. At a European port, $300 million worth of gold from Burkina Faso was stopped, frozen by authorities under pressure no one openly admitted. But every sign pointed to Washington, and then came the voice of Donald Trump, blunt and unmistakable. If Africa wants access to global markets, it must pay its price. That one sentence, sharp as steel, ripped open centuries of history. For some, it sounded like policy. For others, like a chain snapping shut. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the impact was immediate. A mother standing outside a closed health clinic whispered to reporters, "That gold was for medicine. My son has a fever we can't treat." Across the nation, headlines turned to questions, and questions turned to outrage. Can a nation be free if its wealth can be frozen by someone else's signature? Is sovereignty real, or just a word printed on a flag? This story is about far more than a shipment. It's about dignity, independence, and whether Africa will be allowed to choose its own future or be told again what it can and cannot do. So before we dive deeper, ask yourself this. What would you do if your country's gold, your future, was taken with a phone call? If you believe a nation has the right to control its own resources, then subscribe to this channel, because this isn't just a news report. It's a story of resistance, power, and one leader's refusal to bow. Stay with us. The next 20 minutes will show you a side of Africa the headlines won't. The day the gold was frozen, the sun over Ouagadougou didn't rise any differently, but something in the air had shifted. Word spread fast. $300 million in gold bars, mined from the dust and blood of Burkina Faso soil, was halted at a European port. Not because of a legal dispute, not because of technicalities, but because Washington made a call. There were no planes overhead, no troops on the ground, and yet the impact was seismic. With one decision, the lifeline meant to build schools, staff hospitals, and purchase grain vanished, turned from national wealth into international leverage. In neighborhoods where most families survive on less than $2,000 a year, the numbers felt unreal. How could something worth $300 million do enough to vaccinate a generation or power entire villages be confiscated with no vote, no warning, no justice? The government's official statement was brief, careful. But inside ministries, panic pulsed through the halls. Phone lines lit up, emergency meetings were called. And then came the whispers. The order came from the United States, masked behind IMF policy and international compliance protocols. That was when the story moved from economics to identity. Because if gold, mined by hands blistered by sun and time, can be stopped before reaching home, then who really owns it? In rural towns, disbelief turned to fury. In Dori, a teacher stood before his half-empty classroom and told his students, "Your future is being held hostage." In the Southwest, a farmer who had sold his jewelry to pay school fees said, "We're told to work hard, and when we do, they still take it." Local radio stations looped the same haunting question. Who decides the fate of our gold? Meanwhile, in European media, the freeze was framed as a precaution. Western analysts spoke of risk profiles and non-compliance with debt repayment terms. But for the people of Burkina Faso, the message was simpler and more chilling. We don't trust you with your own resources. It wasn't just the gold that had been frozen. It was national dignity, ambition, and the fragile hope of a new financial path. President Ibrahim Traoré, still new to power but already carrying the weight of history, watched as his administration scrambled to understand the full scope. Internal memos revealed IMF concerns about Burkina Faso's shift toward BRICS partnerships. Officials noted an increasing pivot to non-dollar trade. In Washington, insiders began calling it the Sahel lesson, a warning to other African nations: step out of line, and the tools of finance would become weapons. Yet behind these moves lay deeper intent. The freeze was a message, not a mistake. It was a reminder. Even when gold lies beneath your feet, the rules are written elsewhere. And here's the coldest truth: this wasn't the first time. For over 5 decades, Burkina Faso has exported gold, cotton, and other minerals. Contracts, often signed under duress or by former regimes, locked future generations into repayment schedules written by foreign hands. What made this moment different was that the people knew it. From university students to roadside vendors, the mood was shifting. As one young woman said during a street interview, this isn't just theft. It's control wearing a suit. The gold, still sitting in its warehouse overseas, became more than metal. It became metaphor. For every hospital wing left unbuilt, every road left unpaved, every child turned away from care, people began pointing to that gold. Even the currency conversion itself added insult. Burkina Faso was expected to repay loans in US dollars while exporting raw resources that gained value only after refinement abroad. It was the same old cycle, disguised as development. On a radio call-in show, a retired army colonel summed it up bluntly: "We mine it, they freeze it, and then they loan it back to us with interest." Meanwhile, inside the Ministry of Finance, documents showed that if the gold remained blocked, the country could miss critical payments for food imports and vaccine procurement. The implications stretched beyond pride into survival. It was no longer theoretical, it was urgent. International organizations spoke of technical frameworks, but in the streets, the language was human. One sign carried during an early protest read, "My child cannot eat an interest rate." And it was then, when people realized this was not a glitch but a strategy, that the energy changed. What began as shock became fuel. The people were asking not just what happened, but why and who benefits. And most importantly, who will stand up? Because something was about to break. The pressure was building. The silence from traditional allies was deafening. And Traoré, the young captain who had taken power with a promise to restore dignity, would soon have to decide, confront or comply. The next move would define more than policy. It would define the nation's future. But what exactly would that next move be? And who, outside Burkina Faso, was prepared for what was coming? He could have chosen silence. He could have issued a mild statement, called for patience, framed the crisis as a misunderstanding. But instead, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before his cabinet, eyes sharp, voice unwavering, and declared, "This is not debt. This is control." The words echoed far beyond the walls of that room. Within hours, they were on every mobile phone in Burkina Faso, shared through WhatsApp groups, replayed on independent radio stations, and quoted by street vendors who rarely spoke of finance, but knew the scent of injustice when it filled the air. What happened next was not orchestrated. It was instinctive. By sunrise the next day, thousands had filled the streets of Ouagadougou, not with rocks or rifles, but with signs, voices, and determination. Elderly veterans marched beside students. Gold miners still in work boots walked alongside teachers in worn sandals. A mother pushed her baby in a homemade stroller with a cardboard sign taped to the front. "Our gold is not for sale." Another man, limping from an old injury, shouted with raw passion, "They steal in daylight and call it law." What shocked outside observers was not just the size of the protest, but its tone. This was not a riot of anger. It was a movement of defiance. Banners read, "Debt is not destiny." Others showed painted vaults locked by foreign hands with the caption, "Unlock Africa." The scene was breathtaking, controlled, purposeful, and fiercely united. The police didn't intervene. Even some uniformed officers off duty joined the march. A retired judge watching from his window was seen wiping away tears. For many, it was the first time in decades they had seen such a cross-section of the nation, old and young, urban and rural, educated and working class, stand shoulder to shoulder for one cause: sovereignty. And yet, in Paris, London, and New York, the headlines read differently. "Chaos in the Sahel," one paper wrote. "Instability in Burkina Faso." News anchors framed the movement as a sign of democratic collapse, painting Traoré as reckless, unqualified, or worse. But on the ground, it was a different story. The chants were not about overthrowing governments. They were about taking back ownership. One university graduate, holding a sign with IMF loan interest rates written in bold marker, said, "We pay $30 billion a year in interest across Africa. That's not assistance. That's a system." Even local clergy joined in, holding prayer circles in public squares, invoking God not for wealth, but for wisdom and strength. The symbolism was thick. Small stones painted gold were handed out among protesters, a reminder that the wealth beneath their feet was real, tangible, and theirs. Elderly women clutched rosaries while chanting slogans. A young boy stood on a bucket and recited Traoré's speech word for word as a crowd clapped. Journalists from neighboring Mali and Niger arrived to document the movement, and what they found was more than protest. It was purpose. Here in the dust of West Africa, people were writing a new chapter, one not about violence, but about voice. And the world, despite its skepticism, was watching. Even within embassies and diplomatic missions, reports were sent back with caution. This is not a fleeting demonstration. This is a shift. And that shift reached far beyond borders. Images of the marches were shared across West Africa, fueling similar gatherings in Mali, Senegal, and Niger. Hashtags like "Bow our gold, our future" trended across the continent. But as momentum grew, so did the risks. Sanctions were whispered. Credit ratings were threatened. Loans were delayed. And yet, inside Burkina Faso, something far more powerful was happening. The people were not afraid. As one elderly miner said during a town hall, "Better to eat dirt in freedom than wear a suit in chains." If you've ever stood for something that challenged the status quo, if you've ever believed that justice begins when ordinary people raise their voice, then share this video. Because this movement isn't just about gold. It's about us. It's about the dignity of choosing our future. And the more people hear this story, the harder it becomes to ignore. But in the shadows, forces were stirring. Plans were being made. Not on the streets, but in boardrooms and back channels. And the question now wasn't just how far the people would go, but how far their opponents were willing to push back. Could unity withstand sabotage? Could faith survive pressure? Could the fire lit in Ouagadougou burn across a continent? Or would it be smothered before it truly caught flame? The gold may have been frozen in a port thousands of miles away, but the consequences fell hard and fast at home. Within days of the announcement, suppliers pulled out of hospital contracts, citing financial uncertainty. Clinics in the north reported stockouts of antibiotics and fuel. In one maternity ward, a nurse whispered to local media, "We have 2 incubators, both failing. We were waiting on parts paid for with that gold." Her voice cracked as she added, "We pray they don't die." Across Burkina Faso, the real cost of frozen assets came into focus, not in policy documents, but in lives. Imported food supplies stalled. Grain shipments were delayed. Government tenders were canceled. In villages already on the edge of scarcity, children were pulled from school to help find water or fuel. An elderly farmer in Bobo Dioulasso put it simply, "I sold my last cow for seed. If we can't get fertilizer, I lose everything." His hands trembled, not from fear, but from age and hunger. This wasn't theoretical economics. It was survival, and the pain wasn't only rural. In the capital, small business owners who relied on import-export credit found their accounts frozen or flagged. A tailor, who employed 7 apprentices, broke down in tears as she explained, "They told me my dollar payments are under review. My cloth is stuck in port. I cannot feed my workers." Yet while the economic pulse weakened, the political temperature rose. Parliament saw fiery debates as some members urged negotiation with the IMF to restore liquidity. Others called such suggestions betrayal. President Traoré held firm, warning his ministers that surrendering would set a precedent worse than poverty. "If we yield now, we are not buying peace," he said. "We are selling our future." His approval rating among the population surged, even as foreign media painted him as reckless. And inside the halls of power, a generational divide grew sharper. Younger officials supported Traoré's defiance, calling for structural sovereignty. Older elites, many with ties to French or American institutions, feared what would come next. The standoff had begun to fracture more than finances. It was exposing loyalties. Inside the Ministry of Finance, internal memos showed frantic recalculations. With the gold frozen, foreign reserves dipped. Loans previously negotiated under CFA franc frameworks became vulnerable. Ratings agencies in Europe issued quiet warnings, Burkina Faso at elevated risk. Investors pulled back. The World Bank suspended a disbursement. And yet, on the streets, the sentiment was more resolved than panicked. "Let them go," said one young entrepreneur. "If they can freeze our future, we'll build a new one." University protests shifted into working groups, students studying public finance, barter systems, cryptocurrency alternatives. In churches and mosques, sermons turned political. One pastor asked his congregation, "What is the price of silence? Will we let our children inherit debt we never chose?" Even in the countryside, a movement of understanding had begun. Community radio stations broadcast explainers on how gold is traded, how IMF contracts are written. Knowledge itself became resistance. And in this resistance, identity was reforged. Meanwhile, Traoré's administration saw alternatives. India expressed interest in purchasing gold directly. BRICS-aligned banks explored bilateral credit lines. Russian and Chinese firms offered refining technology. If even a portion of these offers materialized, they could restore cash flow and bypass the very systems choking the country. But the West moved quickly to isolate such maneuvers. Insurance firms withdrew coverage. Export intermediaries canceled contracts. A French official, speaking anonymously, said, "We must show that this path is unsustainable." Yet what they failed to grasp was this. For the people of Burkina Faso, unsustainable was already their daily reality. What they wanted wasn't stability built on submission, but a future built on dignity. And here lies the question. If a government refuses to pay for debts it never signed, is that fiscal irresponsibility or moral clarity? If a nation chooses hardship over humiliation, does that make it weak or stronger than ever before? If you believe that no people should be punished for contracts they never consented to, then like this video, because silence helps no one, and visibility is power. As financial pressure mounted, so too did a sense of clarity. For years, Burkina Faso's political class had spoken of development while signing deals that mortgaged its minerals. Now that cycle was being broken. But would the world let it stand? Or would the full weight of international finance come crashing down to restore the old order? The protests continued. The gold remained frozen. And somewhere in the space between dignity and desperation, a new doctrine was forming. One that no rating agency could measure and no loan officer could silence. In Washington, it was never about the gold. It was about the signal. A document leaked from a European bank days after the freeze confirmed what many had suspected. This wasn't a decision made in Brussels. It originated in the corridors of American influence. The internal memo carried the stamp of urgency, referencing IMF exposure risk and non-aligned pivot by Ouagadougou. Translation: Burkina Faso was getting too close to BRICS. In private conversations, U.S. officials referred to it as financial containment. On paper, it sounded procedural. But on the ground, it was pressure disguised as policy. Donald Trump's public statement left no room for misinterpretation. If Africa wants a seat at the global trade table, it must play by IMF rules. That line, broadcast globally, did more than clarify intent. It cemented the narrative that sovereignty, to some, remains conditional. Across Africa, the reaction was swift and visceral. Editorials in Dakar, Kampala, and Lagos fired back. Since when did trade come with shackles? Analysts began to speak of soft war. No troops, no bombs, just spreadsheets and sanctions. But the real story was unfolding elsewhere. In Delhi, Indian officials proposed a new deal. Direct gold purchase in rupees, bypassing dollar clearing entirely. Russian firms offered refinery equipment at below-market rates. China signaled willingness to process Burkina's gold through Shanghai, offering higher margins than European buyers. For years, BRICS had spoken of de-dollarization. Now, thanks to a frozen shipment in West Africa, they had their first high-stakes test case. But the pushback wasn't only financial, it was narrative. Western media painted Traoré as reckless, impulsive, a boy soldier with delusions of grandeur. The New York Times called his resistance performative sovereignty. In contrast, African media framed him as a symbol of courage. A cartoon in a Nigerian paper showed Traoré standing barefoot atop a mountain of gold, holding a broken contract in one hand and a shovel in the other. The caption, "We build with what they tried to bury." In universities from Accra to Addis Ababa, his speeches became lecture material. Students debated the implications of Bretton Woods, the legality of IMF terms, and whether Africa could truly forge its own financial destiny. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. It had become a continental referendum on legitimacy. Meanwhile, in Washington, the playbook unfolded predictably. Credit agencies downgraded Burkina Faso. Trade insurance evaporated. Aid discussions were paused pending review. Yet these moves, intended to isolate, instead united. Mali and Niger reaffirmed their alliance. Guinea offered bauxite. Chad pledged cattle for export. A new economy, built on trust rather than treaties, was beginning to emerge. One official from the African Union remarked privately, "They wanted to freeze $300 million. What they triggered was a thawing of fear." But retaliation wasn't off the table. Reports surfaced of foreign funding entering opposition groups within Burkina Faso. Intelligence leaks hinted at attempts to sow division within the military. A whisper campaign painted Traoré as a populist with no economic plan. But the streets told a different story. Graffiti appeared in cities reading, "They fear what they cannot control." In response, the Burkina administration released a chilling but clear statement. When sanctions fail, they will try sabotage. And still, the people stood firm. Their confidence wasn't rooted in numbers, but in ownership. One gold miner, interviewed by a foreign correspondent, held up a handful of soil and said, "They can freeze it in Europe, but this still belongs to us." And this is where the story deepens. Because what was frozen in one port might unlock a global shift. If Burkina Faso succeeds in bypassing the dollar system, if BRICS nations formalize gold for goods trade, if African states begin to stock reserves independently, then the very architecture of global finance begins to shift. Not collapse, but mutate. And for the West, that is more threatening than any missile. It's precedent. So ask yourself this: why was the reaction so aggressive, so swift, so coordinated? Because sovereignty, when real, is contagious. And the fear wasn't about one gold shipment. It was about the idea that Africa might finally stop asking for permission. If you believe that every people, no matter how small, deserves the right to chart its future without external dictates, then lift this story higher. Share it. Pray for those who dare to resist. Because faith isn't just belief. It's standing for something even when the world tells you to kneel. The lines have been drawn. The world is watching. And in boardrooms and prayer rooms alike, the question now hangs: will the West tighten its grip? Or will Africa slip from its grasp, not with fury, but with faith? If the freeze was an act of economic war, then the response would be a declaration of strategic independence. Within weeks of the gold seizure, President Ibrahim Traoré convened an emergency summit of the Alliance of Sahel States, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. The question on the table was radical in its simplicity. Why should Africa's wealth be stored anywhere but Africa? For decades, gold mined under African sun was flown to vaults beneath Paris, Zurich, or London, marked as collateral, then leveraged for loans. This time the leaders asked, what if that chain could be broken? The answer came in the form of a plan, a fortified gold reserve built on Sahel soil, guarded by Sahel soldiers, and governed by Sahel sovereignty. It would not be symbolic. It would be steel, concrete, and conviction. A location was chosen, remote, defensible, near a military base, yet close enough to key infrastructure routes. Engineers surveyed the land. Maps were drawn. But it wasn't just governments taking action. In a stunning show of unity, citizens responded as if conscripted by spirit. Farmers donated grain to feed the soldiers guarding the site. Miners volunteered to dig the vaults. Street vendors offered small sums, $5, $10, sometimes less, but with handwritten notes that read, "For our future." A retired mason walked 12 kilometers to offer his labor, telling officials, "I built colonial banks. Now let me build something for us." It wasn't just construction. It was communion. Murals appeared overnight on the walls of Ouagadougou, images of golden bars locked behind African shields. Children painted slogans, "Guard the gold," "Guard the future." In Bamako and Niamey, rallies formed in support as radio stations broadcast live updates from the site. This wasn't propaganda. It was participation. Regional economists ran calculations. If the three Sahel nations pooled their existing gold reserves, estimated at over $1.2 billion, and redirected just 20% of future exports into the vault, they could create a base strong enough to issue sovereign-backed credit without IMF conditions. Not in theory, in practice. The impact would be monumental. interest payments to international lenders could be slashed by a third, that savings could fund irrigation systems, power grids, or transport hubs. And perhaps most importantly, it would restore leverage to African hands. But boldness invites backlash. Within days of the announcement, foreign consultants warned of monetary instability. Western embassies issued statements about undermining global financial architecture. International media labeled the move populist adventurism. Behind closed doors, intelligence sources spoke of preemptive disruption, coded language for sabotage. Yet none of it slowed the work. If anything, it accelerated it. Armed convoys transported construction equipment under military escort. Cement was flown in at night. Engineers worked in rotating shifts. Soldiers drilled not just for defense, but for deterrence. The message was clear. This vault would not be another empty gesture. It would be real, operational, and off-limits to interference. For President Traoré, the reserve was more than a bunker. It was a boundary. In a televised address, he said, "This gold does not belong to Burkina Faso. It belongs to Africa. And it will never again be a hostage to foreign demands." His words stirred something ancient, a memory of empires that once stood proud on African land. And yet, even as pride swelled, the threat of retaliation loomed. Financial pressure was already mounting. Now, whispers of covert interference, destabilization plots, and cyber sabotage began to surface. But the people had already made their choice. As one priest said during a mass held near the construction site, when gold is buried under greed, it corrupts. When it is guarded by sacrifice, it redeems. This wasn't just about economics anymore. It was theology, ideology, identity. A continent long defined by exports was now building something to keep. If you believe that a people have the right to protect what they've earned, if you believe that dignity must have a foundation, then stand with this story, share it, speak it, pray for it. Because gold locked in vaults is only power if it's guarded by belief. And belief, when rooted in unity, is unbreakable. Still, questions lingered in foreign capitals. Would the reserve succeed? Could it be protected? Would it trigger a wave of copycat moves across Africa? And most hauntingly, what happens when a region dares to stand without permission? The vault was halfway complete. The gold had yet to arrive, but the lines had been drawn, and the battle for ownership was no longer metaphor. It was being built, stone by stone, hand by hand, guarded by those who swore never to be subjects again. The walls were rising, the vault was nearly sealed, and yet the greatest test was still ahead. For as the construction of the African gold reserve neared completion, so too did the storm. Western financial systems, threatened not by weapons but by willpower, moved to strike where it hurt most. New sanctions were drafted in silence. Trade partnerships were quietly frozen. Intelligence whispers spoke of infiltration, not through armies, but through algorithms, false narratives, and economic blacklists. The goal was clear, not to attack the vault, but to discredit the idea behind it. Because the greatest threat wasn't the gold inside, it was the faith outside. And as Burkina Faso stood firm, eyes turned across the Sahel and across the world. What began as a local crisis had become a test for every nation that ever dared to dream beyond its assigned role. Could a people, long dismissed, declare ownership of their future and make it stick? Could Africa, often spoken about, finally speak for itself? The risks were growing. If in the next 3 months the reserve is sabotaged, if foreign influence fractures the alliance, or if resource exports are strangled by financial warfare, then Burkina Faso could face isolation more severe than sanctions. It could face starvation of hope. But if they succeed, if the gold is stored, if trade routes diversify, if alliances hold, then the world will witness something rare. The birth of financial sovereignty not dictated by empire or treaty, but by conviction, and that would echo far beyond Africa. It would reach Latin America, Southeast Asia, and indigenous communities in every continent who've been told for centuries that resources come with rules written by others. So now the question stands. Will this be the moment Africa rewrites the rules of engagement with the global economy? Will it be the first step in a world where wealth is no longer measured by access to credit lines, but by the courage to say no to injustice? Or will this too become another chapter of promises interrupted, resistance crushed under the quiet weight of coercion? That answer doesn't lie in the halls of the IMF or the vaults of Brussels. It lies in us, in how we listen, how we respond, and how we remember. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it pass like another headline. Let it live. Comment below with your thoughts. Share this video with someone who still believes in the possibility of change. Subscribe to this channel if you want more truth that challenges silence. And if you're a person of faith, then pray. Pray for the mothers waiting on medicine, for the farmers guarding fields they refuse to sell, and for the children who may grow up under a new doctrine, not debt, but dignity. Because, as President Traoré said in his closing speech at the AES summit, gold is not collateral. Gold is freedom, and freedom is never begged. It is built. In that sentence lies a challenge to the entire world order, a reminder that wealth without control is not wealth, that sovereignty without sacrifice is not sovereignty, and that belief, deep, dangerous, defiant belief, is the one currency no empire can freeze. May God bless the people of Burkina Faso. May He bless every nation that dares to rise, not with anger, but with vision. And may He bless you, the listener, for giving your time to truth. This is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning. The spark has been lit. The vault is being sealed. The eyes of the world are watching. Now what will you do?